Thank you, Heather. Really great to be with you today. Can people hear me in the back, or do I need to? Good? Okay. So professors are used to projecting. Not usually in a room quite this big. My classes are a bit smaller. So I guess I'm a warm-up back to your next speaker, having the second place and then the first place in last year's Rachel Carson Book Award. So it was an honor to be, especially as someone who doesn't write books for a living. Definitely a new experience to be writing this book as someone who has been more on the atmospheric chemistry and environmental engineering and usually writing peer-reviewed papers for maybe 20 or 30 other scientists or experts. And with tenure, I was able to start writing for public audiences again. I had that kind of journalism bug from my high school and college newspaper days, and was able to start writing for general audiences with op-eds and the ideas that I was developing. What do we need to do to address these big problems of transitioning to clean energy, of addressing climate change, led me to start thinking of really a 3-year process of writing this first book that yes, is a real physical book on Amazon, on Kindle audiobook, wherever else, however you like to find your books. Now I've actually I hope I don't look this old, I'm in my 18th year of teaching environmental engineering at Rice. I teach courses on atmospheric chemistry and climate, teach courses on energy and the environment, on climate change solutions. And when I started teaching those courses back in 2007, this was the sort of concern that I was trying to deal with. This is what I was trying to dispel in my students, maybe even less in Rice University students than when I would go to a Rotary Club or I would speak to Boy Scouts and their parents or different groups where get a wide variety of views. And I would try to be sure that I was explaining climate science to address these D words: denial, deception, doubt. People who didn't, at first they didn't believe the world was really warming. Could it just be we have thermometers at airfields or cities are growing? Could that be what it is? Do we really know what the cause of global warming is? And so a lot of this was what I concerned myself with the most. We're beyond a doubt that the world is warming. We're seeing a rate of warming that's never been experienced in, as far as we can go back in the history of Earth's temperatures. The world has been warmer. The world has never warmed this fast in the past. And so if I began teaching here, we've had this extra 0.5 degree Celsius or nearly 1 degree Fahrenheit of warming just since I had the chance to move back to my childhood state of Texas. And hitting this year a point where you don't count each individual year, but we're starting to bump up against the 1.5 degree Celsius target or nearly 3 degrees Fahrenheit target that the Paris Agreement set as its aspirational goal of not allowing warming to get that high, warming above where we were in the pre-industrial era, or sometimes approximated by the late 1800s. And so these Ds are the Ds that I worry about now. What I teach my classes, I almost never get a student who questions that it really is warming. We all see that that's the fact today. I still get it some, but less often get, well, could it be some other reason? And over the course of a semester in atmospheric chemistry and climate, we really see that there's no other way it could be unless you want to envision some space aliens shooting down energy at Earth, but even that doesn't really make sense anymore. Any alternate hypothesis, now that we have satellites seeing the temperature patterns in the troposphere and stratosphere, the patterns that we're seeing there, the way things are changing by season, the way things are changing spatially, all bears fingerprints that we know it's greenhouse gases causing just about all of the warming, with little bits of noise added in from volcanoes and sunspot changes, but really it's dominated by this. And so these Ds I worry about: the despair, the depression, the sense of doom, this doomism that is set in. And I was speaking about this book at a local book festival. They had 10 local authors come and talk about their books, and the person right next to me who was about to speak about hers said it is so important to do what you're doing, to have this about climate solutions, because her book was about a totally different topic. She was talking about teenage trauma, because she was a teen psychologist, psychotherapist, And she said it's gotten to the point, it's changed throughout her career, that now she said what you're dealing with is number two. That like every psychologist or therapist since the beginning of time, the number one problem is family conflict. The number three problem is dropped to three now is eating disorders. And number two is this sort of eco-anxiety, some people call it, this dread, this doom, this feeling. Maybe it's for climate change, maybe it's for other pollution, maybe it's for other changes they see in the world, but this feeling that it's hopeless, that do we have any solutions? Do we have any way of dealing with this? Do we have the agency to be able to make a difference on this? And people come to me and they say, as a young child, I thought I would be able to have kids. I looked forward to being a mom. I look forward to being a dad. And now I realize, we're going extinct and I can't have that future ahead of me. So how do we deal with this anxiety the pendulum has swung so far that we're almost more fearful than what things are, more fearful than the science really shows the changes that are happening? And how could we give people a sense that there's something we can do about it? There are ways of addressing climate change. There are ways of confronting climate change is really important. And just as an aside, I am the father of two children, so I have not made that decision that there's this terrible world ahead of them. Part of that is because, yes, we need to acknowledge that the climate is warming. Climate warming often gets analogized to a bathtub filling up with CO2 and other long-lived greenhouse gases and having this very small hose at the bottom. So the bathtub is going to keep filling up even if we slow down this gusher of human-caused CO2 coming in. We can't just cut this in half. That will still keep this filling up. The only way is if we cut it down almost all the way to net zero, where it can be balanced by sinks removing it. So we are going to keep warming some. How much, I'll get to in the next slide. On the other hand, I came into this studying air pollution. My core PhD work and much of the initial years at Rice, many of the papers I wrote were about air pollution. The air in most cities in the United States, I just got back from Mexico City, where the air is twice as clean or half as much pollution as they used to have a few decades ago. The air is cleaning up because air pollution, what we emit now is what we breathe now, or what we emit now is what we'll breathe in a week or a month. This, we're moving towards much cleaner air than before. So in some ways, we're going to have a better environment than our parents and our grandparents experienced, but we're going to have to deal with this long-lived pollutants fact that's warming up the climate. We have some solutions that are trying to address this now. We have a Paris Climate Agreement that was signed in 2015, a few decades after the world started trying to deal with these problems, dating back to the Earth Summit that was first held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Kept going this back and forth where the world wanted to address it but couldn't come up with a way to do it. They signed a Kyoto Protocol that really didn't work. And finally in Paris, we have a system that goes forward. I go through that history of this in the book, the second and third chapters that deal with some of the diplomacy and the history of these issues. And for all of its flaws, we finally had everyone get on board with a treaty that says that we're going to do something to address this. And it did two main things. It had an Article 2 goal that said we're going to aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius, which I and many other climate scientists unfortunately think we won't be able to achieve. But we said the bright line goal is to say well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial, and that's going to be a really heavy lift. And it actually committed the world to hitting net zero by the second half of the century. That's a bit 50 years of wiggle room. But still, when you hear net zero commitments, when you hear President Biden say he wants the US to be net zero by 2050, when you hear companies say that they're hitting a net zero target, they're actually trying to make themselves mirror the overall world's goal that's 193, 197, whatever the number was, almost every nation on Earth agreed to as the targets for the world. The devil's in the details. How will we actually get there? But at least we're on the same page starting in 2015. We agreed to a temperature goal, we agreed to an emissions goal, and just about every country has stayed with it. I think maybe Western Sahara and maybe Syria during their civil war. And then of course, briefly, Trump got the US out of it just before he left office, and Biden put us back in the day he took office. But for the most part, this is where the world has agreed to in a treaty that's signed by almost every country. when they were actually there locking arms and singing Kumbaya and lighting up the Eiffel Tower with 1.5 degrees, they were kind of blowing smoke. Okay, they didn't actually have a way to get there. What this shows is what would things have been based on what we knew at that time. So 2009 was maybe my 3rd year of teaching my classes. 2015 was when the Paris Agreement got signed. So in this range, if you look at where the policies were, how bad things were with emissions, this is back when solar cost about 8 or 10 times as much as it does today, back when we didn't know how well electric cars would work, back when we were looking to build a dozen new coal plants in Texas, all but one of them never got built. You look at the way the world looked and when scientists and economists were projecting how much emissions we would have based on the pledges and policies that were in place, it looked like we were heading to maybe 3.6 degrees Celsius of warming, even when they signed the Paris Agreement. They signed it, they said, yay, Eiffel Tower's lit up with 1.5 degrees, but the actual policies in place would have caused more than twice that much warming by 2100. And because it wasn't going to get to net zero, yeah, they said net zero, but there weren't any policies for that, we would have kept warming beyond this. That would be a pretty bleak future. That would be as much warming above pre-industrial as nearly as much as pre-industrial was above the depths of the last ice age. It would get us to temperatures that have not been seen in about the past 5 million years or more. Since that time, we've had this incredible downward trend. This is where each year, this climate action tracker, which is a bunch of scientists in Europe, go and they look at where the policies are. And by the time we got to 2021, which was the year that President Biden reset the US targets, actually made them more ambitious than President Obama had made them. European Union issued new targets here. China, Xi Jinping and the Communist Party set their new targets. And if you look at where those targets are, it finally put the pledges where their mouths had been. It finally was, if we get these targets, the US said net zero by 2050, Europe said net zero by 2050, China said carbon neutral by 2060. Now, if you actually achieved those pledges, you would just barely meet the Paris Agreement. And if you look at the policies that are in place, what has Congress actually passed? What has China's Politburo actually passed? What has the European Union Commission actually passed? It's right around here, around maybe a 2.6 degrees Celsius. Not where we need to be. A lot of changes. Okay, we've already had about 1.3 degrees Celsius averaged of warming so far. So we're talking about having another increment up by 2100. It's the same amount as we've gone up since the late 1800s. Much more warming than we want, but not that sort of catastrophic levels of ever-rising warming back then. It's because if we put it in terms of where emissions, so I'm kind of flipping my way of showing things. Now what I'm showing is not, this is when the projections were issued. This is plotted in terms of when the emissions are happening, so projections of how much we'll be emitting. If you looked at where the scenarios were back in 2009, they thought this curve of emissions that's been rising really ever since the steam railroads, or ever since the steam engine was invented, it's been rising inexorably. They thought that this was going to hit about 100 gigatons per year, 100 billion tons per year, about 12 tons per person per year, that this was just going to keep going off the chart. Now we've gotten to this point where the projections are what I say here. Projections are gridlock. Projections are we're not going to get to net zero. We're not going to be end of the world catastrophe, but we're not where we want to be. If we want to be serious about limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, we need to get right near net zero sometime in the second half of this century. So the targets that the Paris Agreement set are in line with what we need to achieve. And we're starting to see policies that look more like this. In fact, this has gotten a little bit better since this report came out in 2023. By the end of last year, I was actually serving on a board out in Paris at the International Energy Agency. The head of the International Energy Agency spoke with us. He said, we're about to announce our new forecasts that for the first time they expect all 3 fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal, to have their emissions peak and begin to decline by 2030. Others disagree. OPEC thinks that they have more oil to sell. But this idea of a peak, and some forecasts are starting to look more like these light pink part of the uncertainty range, that we're not soaring, but we're not cutting fast enough for our temperature goals. This is what it means for the world. This is how much hotter we would be at 3 degrees than at 2 degrees. This is how much drier or wetter soils would get. This is how much more precipitation. And when you end up going to a warmer climate, you do have places get wetter, places get drier, but overall you evaporate more water. And if you think of a Texas thunderstorm compared to a Boston drizzle, the more tropical, the warmer you get, the more that the rain comes at the extremes. If you look at the rainiest day of the year, most places are green, most places are going to get wetter. So this is the kind of range that we're dealing with. I wish I could say 1.5 was possible. More likely what we do this century is going to determine, do we stay at the Paris 2-degree cap, or do we stay business as usual? Do we stay in gridlock, and do we end up at a 3-degree warmer world? This is what we likely have ahead of us in your lifetimes. So my book, looking at how to address this, was carried out in 3 parts. A diplomacy part: what do we need to do internationally? What do we need to do changing technologies? And how are the domestic policies that can put all this together? I'm an engineering professor. I come from the technology side of things. So you'll see the most chapters and most of what I'll be talking about today is what is it that we need to do on the technology piece. Why I did those 3 aspects, though, is because we need all 3. If we don't have domestic policy, then we don't have the clout and credibility to go to the other countries of the world and say, hey, you need to clean up too. Because if all we do is clean up domestically, we're only dealing with a 14% and shrinking share of the pie is what the US emits. US historically was larger. We're down to 14% and shrinking. So it's a necessary but not sufficient condition of addressing climate change, of confronting climate gridlock, for the US to act. So we emit more per person than any other major country, more of the CO2 in the air if you tracked what's up there, because it's been accumulating for a century and more. The most molecules would have a made in the USA tag, more than any other country. But we've been shrinking that total. China's been growing faster. Africa and Southeast Asia are growing faster. If we only cut our part, we would be able to ward off maybe up to 0.2 of a degree Celsius of that warming we're expecting, but we would still be way above our goal. So we need to be able to have the clout to ask others to act, and then we need diplomacy to leverage what happens in any given country. Diplomacy needs technology needs diplomacy so that we can collaborate on technologies. Technologies allow us to do more. They would never have agreed to the Paris Agreement if solar hadn't begun to get cheap, if wind hadn't begun to get cheap, if batteries weren't starting to get cheap, if they thought they were impoverishing their countries, if they thought they were making themselves shiver in the dark, they would never have agreed to it. So technologies enabled them to go for ambitious diplomacy. And then this interaction between policy and technology, this idea that when we have policy, it can drive technology to innovate. This is something that I saw before I came to Rice after my PhD at Georgia Tech. I worked for Georgia's air agency on air pollution control policies. We always gave the example that we tried to emulate in the policies we set of how policy and technology interact. And the classic example is when EPA was considering limiting how much SO2 came out of coal power plants back in the 1980s, and then President George H.W. Bush actually signed a deal with Canada, and they agreed to cut their emissions by more than half. And EPA was setting up a cap and trade program for that, and they asked what would it cost to put in these controls. And so industry said, oh gosh, that's so expensive, these technologies barely exist yet, it's going to cost this much for us to do this, trust us, we know our power plants better than any other. EPA came in, their analysts, largely people with environmental training, were a little bit more optimistic, and they said, we're going to use our spreadsheets, we're going to do our analysis, and we think it's going to cost this much. So who was right? Was industry right, knowing their stuff? Was EPA right, knowing their stuff? President Bush, first Bush, indeed passed this, required a 50% cut in SO2, so they had to put their money where their mouth was. How many think industry was right up here? How many think EPA was right down here? How many want to split the difference and say somewhere in the middle? How many have a different answer? Anyone have the right answer? Okay, the reality is down here. When you actually have a policy and you don't just argue policy and you don't just trade white papers back and forth and public comments back and forth, but you actually have to go out and say, we actually have to cut these. We actually have a cap and trade that puts a value on cutting these. Then you do learning by doing. Regulation drives innovation. When you actually have to do it, you don't just do spreadsheet exercises. Engineers, technology get things done. And then once you do that, technology drives policy. Technology enables more ambitious policy. So they were able to keep lowering that cap. They said, wait, it was only half the cost you told us. And then the cost kept coming down. So now SO2 emissions are actually 90% lower in the United States than they were when they first started those exercises. Okay, so how can we have climate policy look like those air pollution policies? What technologies do we need to make cheap? Well, I argue that we need to build our clean energy future mainly on these three pillars. We need energy efficiency, we need clean electricity, we need to use that clean electricity to electrify what we can and use clean fuels for what we can't. I put these as small pillars that I devote chapters to, is that we also need to control things other than CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, halocarbons, but those are about 20% of the total problem. So yes, they're absolutely essential to address, but fossil fuels are responsible for about 90% of all CO2 emissions, of all anthropogenic CO2 emissions. So this is what is going to be the lion's share of what we need to do. Carbon sinks, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, whether by natural and vegetation and soil ways, or whether by engineering direct air capture. If you get to net zero, you need to have some sinks to get there, but only if we move to clean energy, only if we transition from an economy that is still 79% fossil fuel in the US, is still 80% fossil fuel globally, unless we shrink this down, unless we go from about 36 billion tons a year now into maybe some low single digit number, maybe 5 billion tons, is it even possible to design things that you could offset that remaining 5 or 10? If we don't do this, we have no hope of cleaning up the sinks. How these tie together is we need to be efficient, or else we'll need to build twice as many solar farms, twice as many wind farms. We need to be efficient so that we don't need enormous electric car batteries. Clean electricity, we need to make electrification worthwhile. Why would my wife and I have bought our electric cars if we were just going to run them off of coal electricity? It would barely do any good. By making electricity clean, it makes sense to electrify. You can only get so efficient if you don't electrify. Electric car motors are 2 to 3 times as efficient as internal combustion engines, gasoline or diesel. So you can only get efficiency so far with cleaner rolling tires or better aerodynamics. You actually need electric cars, you need heat pumps to be a few times as efficient as what a traditional furnace or a traditional internal combustion engine can do. Electrification needs to be done the right way to help, so that it helps rather than hurts clean electricity. If all of you do like my wife and I have done, get electric cars, and we all plug in at the same time, right as the sun is setting and right when the winds are slow, we're going to crash the grid. Or do we have smart chargers that realize that we can wait? I don't need my car charged up until I leave the next day. Can I wait until it's windy and sunny and there's plenty of power and there's cheap power prices? So can we do that with smart charging, with smart water heaters and so on? And only if we get so much clean electricity, cleaner than it's ever been, cheaper than it's ever been, more abundant than it's ever been, can we even think about doing this stuff? Can we even think about using extra wind and solar or nuclear or whatever the clean thing is that we build to start running these fans and pulling CO2 out of the air? Will we be able to have enough clean energy left over to make hydrogen by electricity splitting water and making hydrogen cleaner than we do before? If we're still running a lot of coal power plants in the US and globally, if we haven't replaced those yet, these don't do nearly as good as cleaning this up. So we need to do this so well and so abundantly that these become viable and affordable options. As my book was going to press, President Biden, well, it was at the publisher, President Biden came out with his strategy. I was like, oh, did he scoop me? Did he change it? He came up with the same pillars as what I had written, how he wanted his White House strategy to go from the US emitting 6.5 billion tons a year down to a net zero target in 2050, same pillars: efficiency, clean electricity, electrification and low carbon fuels, do the lion's share of the work. Then what's left is, yes, is the other greenhouse gases, and yes, is these two types of sinks to get to zero. But 3/4 of what we need to do is these three pillars. CO2 removal technologies require lots and lots of clean electricity to run them. Now, some would say this can't be done, or some would say this can't be done fast enough. Okay, Václav Smil, famous Canadian professor, favorite author quoted by Bill Gates and others, says, look, yeah, we can transition. Yeah, we've transitioned energy over time, but it's usually a 50 to 100-year process. You're not going to be able to confront that gridlock fast enough to meet our goals. Because we actually were a renewable fuel economy. We were a wood economy for the first couple centuries of our country's existence, first 100 years of our country's existence. And it took 100 years for coal to go from just being mined a little bit to being the coal era. And then oil and gas, it took a long time for them to grow. And renewables are only growing very slowly. If you look at the projections of renewables, yes, it's growing faster than anything else, but only fast enough to flatline oil and natural gas in the US projections. These are much more pessimistic than the International Energy Agency's projections, but all of them showed we aren't growing this fast enough. And if we don't grow them fast enough, then emissions are projected to only decline slowly, not to get to President Biden's emissions reductions target. This is the headline that came out globally right after the meeting that I was at, showing that IEA now thinks we're about to hit this peak of coal, of oil, of natural gas that have all been going up, finally going to start coming down by 2030, but again, not declining fast enough. So what we need is not to have curves like those Václav Smil, like those coal, oil, and gas era. We need curves like this. We need these S-curves of rapid adoption. We need, iPhones that were just invented, or smartphones that were just invented, and nearly everyone had, or cell phones, pretty soon everyone had them. Black and white TVs invented. They became ubiquitous in homes. We have this curve where they get adopted slowly, but then they become ubiquitous, and then you saturate out as you get near 100% adoption. Then color TVs came out, and everyone ditched their black and white TVs and went to color. So how do we do this? And how do we have, for the parts of the world whose emissions are growing fastest, that they can make the leap straight to it? How do they leap over the coal era and the oil and gas era that we've had and go straight to cleaner technologies, go straight to wind and solar and electric cars, just like they've done with phone lines in parts of the world where they never installed landlines? They just went straight to cell phones that have become ubiquitous, even in many developing parts of the world. Transitions like that, when something is better and cheaper, we do it quickly. Here was the one early adopter of a car in 1900, all horses. Where'd the horses go in 1913? Okay, when something is better, when people want it, when it becomes affordable enough, it becomes ubiquitous. Okay, unfortunately, horses sent out to pasture, and unfortunately, much worse fates. Interestingly, California in 2022 gave itself that same amount of time, 13 years, when they're banning sales of new internal combustion engine cars in California. They're acquiring zero emission vehicles by 2035. So they think they can get there. We can often do better than expected, because if we just think that it's always going to be this slow and forget that it can actually be this fast, we miss these curves. Each of these curves is that International Energy Agency projecting how much solar would be installed in each future year out to 2040. And it kept going up and up. In 2016, they said, well, we installed more than we thought, but that was a fluke. There was just something weird that happened that we installed more than we thought. We're just going to peak out there. Ends up, how much was added last year? We're still waiting for the final numbers to come in, but roughly 390 gigawatts. Okay, IEA back even as recently as 2020 thought we would never install that much in a single year. Okay, 390, okay, about 20 times as much solar got added last year as the smartest wonks out in Paris thought would be the case globally. In fact, China installed more than half of that. China installed more solar panels last year than the US has installed in its history. Okay, so I often get, why should the US do anything when China isn't doing anything? There's a lot that China's doing wrong. Okay, but China is building more solar panels, more wind farms, more nuclear plants, more electric cars than we are, so it's not so much whataboutism to say we shouldn't do anything ourselves. Okay, this is how that growth has been happening, expecting it to hit 700 gigawatts. Okay, way off my chart before, a few times above the screen, through the roof, is what now the projections are showing. We got there because the cost came down, because this is what IEA thought costs would do. IEA is smart. IEA knows something you can make in factories. You can keep making cheaper and cheaper. But they thought that the cost would still be 12 cents a kilowatt hour all the way out to the 2040s. In fact, and even Ramez Nam, a famous futurist, thought we would be here. In fact, solar costs 3 cents a kilowatt hour in sunny places now before you count the subsidies. In fact, the biggest problem, you look at investment newsletters, they're worried how are solar companies going to make money because they're selling solar panels for 20, 25 cents a watt. When I started teaching my class, solar panels cost $4 a watt. DOE hit an impossible target, the Sunshot Initiative, to try to bring it down to $1 a watt. Okay, now we're down at 25 cents. Coincidentally, the head of that Sunshot project is now our vice president at Rice. This is not something unique to solar. This is the cost curve of Ford Model Ts. Okay, what did Henry Ford say? You can have any color of Model T, any color of car, as long as it's black. You want to be able to have his factories make again and again and again the same things. Learning by doing, the more you do something, the more you bring the cost down. This is the cost curve of lithium-ion batteries. Okay, costs come down. This is what we see for all of these technologies: wind, offshore and onshore, solar PV, solar, concentrated solar. Each of these, if you plot, this is how much has ever been deployed in history globally. This is what it costs to deploy it. You have this learning by doing, sometimes called Swanson's law. Each doubling of deployment, costs come down roughly 20%. Okay, we've had lots of doublings of deployment to get to where we're adding 300 gigawatts a year. So lots and lots of deployments, lots and lots of 20% cuts. And we've had solar fall from 40 cents a kilowatt hour down to, I would argue it's more like 30 cents a kilowatt hour. 3 cents a kilowatt hour today. It's not a law of nature that costs will come down. This is the cost curve for nuclear. Anything weird about where the nuclear curve ends? Why does it end in 1978? When was the last time the US opened a new nuclear plant? 1978. Okay, wish it was before I was born. I was a toddler. Okay, so we don't have a cost curve. We'll finally have a new data point once they finish the new plant in Georgia. The Vogtle plant is going to open up 2 nuclear reactors about 5 years behind schedule, about 3 times budget. So we'll have a new data point that'll be even higher than this. Okay, we don't have learning by doing if we don't do. We don't make these things modularly in a factory. These look more like huge construction projects. Okay, if we had to rebuild the interstate highway system today, would it be more or less expensive than when Eisenhower started us building it back in the 1950s? Compared to something where you just do things again and again, a commoditized widget that you make over and over again in a factory is very different than a huge project that we're not doing enough of. Okay, so to get there, what we need is yes, we need the technologies to exist. We need research and development. But the biggest thing we need is this market demand pull. We need the doing. We need to have something happen. We need to be adopting this even before it's quite as affordable as we need it to be, even before it's quite the best option. And we can do it by carrots, incentives, tax credits, by purchase decisions. We can do it by mean things, by putting taxes on things, by mandates, by regulation. I thought my policy chapter was going to be saying this is exactly what we should do. I ended up deciding it's this. We need technology push, and we need most of all, a market demand pull, and I don't care how you do it. You can have your own philosophy, your own religion, your own political party will make you prefer one of these ways or another, but somehow we need both of these. We need to push technologies out there, make them exist, and then most of all, we need to get them adopted, whatever strategy you have for doing that. So it ends up being on a curve like this. R&D pushes down, demand pull pulls it forward. The more that we deploy, the more that costs come down. I hope this is a hopeful message for you that overcomes that despair, that depression, that doomism, where you feel like you're always pushing the boulder up the hill like Sisyphus that rolls back down on top of you each night. The great thing about learning by doing, the great thing about technology development is that this is the way that costs want to go, but this is a really sticky, a really high friction curve. So only if we do everything that we can on R&D, only if we do everything we can on this demand pull, can we make this happen fast enough to address emissions, to bring things down fast enough for where we need to be for our climate goals. Where we are, I need to be turning to questions. So I'll just jump through that. Where the costs are now is that the renewables are cheapest. And so all the scenarios assume that it's renewables that we're going to keep deploying faster than anything else. Even without the strategies, this is what the grid looks like in the future. Noon, this is without a decarbonization strategy. This is where Department of Energy thinks our grid is heading. Instead of coal and nuclear and gas as the base, we're deploying solar so fast that it's going to be that sort of grid in the future. If we want to go all the way to net zero, we're going to need a lot of land for these. The blue shows how much land would be in sight of a wind turbine. The tiny, tiny blue square shows actually how much of a pad and roads are needed for those turbines. The oranges show different scenarios of how much solar we would need to make the US net zero by 2050. Those are Princeton scenarios. We need more power lines to do it. We need clean ways of making heat. We need clean ways of making hydrogen. We need agricultural strategies that reduce emissions. And yes, we need carbon capture. Yes, we need carbon removal. But that is the last and least thing we need. Until we have more clean electricity, more clean energy than we know what to do with for all those other things, until we do that, it doesn't make sense to use it beyond demonstration scale for carbon capture when we need to be just getting replaced those plants. The Sunshot effort with our new vice president at Rice, all these efforts are trying to bring down the cost of these technologies. And so I'll conclude with just recapping this new paradigm I'm suggesting, is we need to think beyond the carbon footprint. We need to think beyond just doing less. Think beyond just shrinking what we do, because if all we do is shrink our personal footprints, if all we do is even shrink the entire US footprint, then we're only shrinking 14% of the world, and no one else is going to want to follow our lead. If we just shiver in the dark, if we just, turning down the thermostat is great, going vegan is great, but if that's all we do, no one else is going to want to follow us. We aren't going to be building up technologies. We're not going to be making the clean stuff cheap that's going to make the rest of the world want to adopt it. So where I see the paradigm is, yes, there's nothing wrong with this. Yes, this is a good thing to shrink, but this is where you really enable all of the world to go to this clean energy future. So I hope I've given you some ideas of paths forward. I hope I've given you some hope to some of those who are despaired. Maybe I reminded you that, yes, this is a real problem that we need to address for anyone who was still feeling denial of climate change, and I welcome the questions you have.